This to me is probably the easiest part of job search to get better at. Uh, I've taught job seeking skills for about 20 some years. And when people get to the interview, generally they just think, there's nothing I can do other than be myself and answer their questions. And, they're gonna know I'm good at what I do. The answer is they generally don't unless you tell them. And showing someone something is a lot different than describing it to them. I've interviewed a lot of people, and I have to say there is a real difference between a well-prepared candidate and someone who is just, like I said, winging it. So what I'm hoping to do for you today is let you know these 3 or 4 points here. I'm going to talk about how to research an employer and the job, how to know the skills they need, and how to make the connection between your experience and what they need you to do, how to check your attitude, because just proving to an employer that you want the position is half the battle. And then, some of the things that are a little easier to take care of, and that is, looking good and meeting expectations for what the employer thinks someone working for them should present themselves as, okay? But we certainly can take a ton of questions. So if there's any questions you have specific to interviewing, please put them in the chat box and I'll pause. Or probably the best thing is Sheila will turn her camera on, and when I see her camera on, I will know that there are questions that we need to get to. Okay, so let's start off. I'd like to start this off by going over the different interview types. With COVID in the last 2 years, coming up on 2 years now, of what we've been dealing with, a lot of people assume that it's all going to be online or over the phone. That's not something you should do. Some employers are interviewing in person. In fact, more and more are interviewing in person. And there's a lot of questions about that. How do I do that safely? How do I ask certain questions? They've heard the questions a lot. It's not about the questions you ask, it's about how you ask them. So instead of saying, I would fully expect the interview panel to be masked and safety precautions and all that sort of stuff, that may be very important to you, but how you ask it sets the stage for how they're going to be receiving your information. So saying something like, could you let me know what safety protocols are so I make sure that I am adhering to your process? They'll let you know. And that starts a conversation very conversationally as opposed to adversarially, if that's even a word. You want to be very sure that nothing that you present comes off as negative, because it's really hard to overcome that if that's the first impression they have. So we'll get more into that. But we're going to talk about first the telephone screening. Telephone screening used to be for the purpose of saving time and resources for employers. What they would do is they would get a candidate pool. Let's say they had a good job. And I'll give you an example, by the way. I had a situation in which an employer hired me to screen a bunch of candidates. And I've done this a few times. For very large candidate pools, you get way more people than you need to interview. So you're not going to interview everybody. So I worked with one employer who had 500 candidates for, I don't want to say one job, but a very small pool of jobs. And there's no way that they could have interviewed all those people. So I screened them for them. I've done in-person screenings. I've done telephone screenings. I've been assessment screenings. I've done assessment screenings for employers. And what this does is it takes a very large pool and filters it down to something they can handle, okay? So the idea of a telephone screening is they're going to ask you more general questions. In many cases, like when I was hired to do it, it's not even the employer who's doing the screening. So you may get kind of a weird vibe in which, boy, it doesn't even sound like this is the employer. You may ask questions that they don't have the answers to. If you know it's a reputable employer, don't be thrown by that. Just understand that that might be their process. They may have hired an outside firm. I interviewed with United Healthcare many years ago, and very quickly realized that my telephone screening was from another company. And once I realized that, I understood the process and I just answered the general questions. What they want to know is, one, are you still interested in the job? Two, who are you? Are you who you appear to be in the application and resume? Because at this point, they haven't talked to you. They've just gotten documentation. And many people, and you should, by the way, get help with their resume. Sometimes they get help with their application. I mean, that's what Career Forge representatives can do. We can help you with your resume. So they're not hiring me. They want to hire you. So they want to see what they're really getting. Because some people will look really good on paper, and then when you talk to them, they're not who they presented themselves to be. So a telephone screening will let them know that. Increasingly, employers are using telephone screenings as more of the traditional interview, meaning that it can take the place of a traditional interview, in-person interview. But you're going to find out very quickly if this is something that is just a filtering device, or if this is the real deal in which you're the candidate that they're comparing against 5 other people. No matter which version of it, it's important to be prepared, and we'll talk about how to prepare for interviews in general as we go along. An in-person screening isn't done a whole lot. I've done it once for a mass hiring. It just brings people in. One of the really nice things is it allows us to check ID. As far as, like for federal jobs, you need to have a social security card. You need to be able to pass a drug screen. You need to have certain, things with you. And when we had a flood in my area, the FEMA came in and they asked us to do the screening. So all day we had people coming in and we did a quick 5-minute screening. And some people were employment ready and some people weren't. And we didn't want to pass on people who weren't employment ready to that next level, because it was limited resources for those in-person interviews. There's something called a selection interview. And by the way, don't get too wound up about the titles of these. You don't need to ask an employer, well, will this be a selection or a behavior or a work sample? Most interviews are a combination of several different types. A selection interview could be multiple interviews, and you might meet with multiple people. It's just some employer's process. They may have, several levels to this. They may take the top 10 candidates, then the top 3, and then they may take the top candidate and even do another interview. That's not done as much as it used to be done, and the reason for that is there's a lot more jobs than there are people looking for work right now as we see it. Now, that does not mean in any way that the job that you want is out there for the pay you want in the area you want. It just means that there are a lot of positions available and not a lot of people applying for them. So employers are being a lot more flexible in the hiring process than they have in the past. And that's a good thing for a job seeker's point of view. However, I do realize it can still be very difficult for any one individual to find the right fit for them. So a behavioral-based interview is more of a type of question. What this allows is an employer to see kind of like your on-the-job behavior, your personality, your character, and it's one of the biggest opportunities to practice and be prepared for interviews, because this is the one that throws a lot of people. It's where they ask questions like, give me a situation in which you've had a disagreement with your supervisor. How did you handle it and what were the results? If you're not prepared for that type of question, it can really throw you, because you may be someone who is a salesperson and you think, well, I sell things to people. I can talk about my sales experience, but now you want to talk about where I've got mad at my boss. Those types of questions talk to how professional you are, how well you get along with others, and how you handle conflict. Because half the battle of any job is getting along with your coworkers or your supervisors. If you can do that well, people can train you into the job itself in many cases. And that's why they ask so many questions that seem to be outside the scope of the actual work. So don't fail to prepare for those questions. And I'll give you some tips on that a little later on here. Work sample, I've done a lot of work sample interviews. I really like them. It's the one opportunity we have to actually showcase what we can do. A work sample would be doing the job itself as part of the interview. Now, not a lot of industries allow for this just because of the work. If you're a phlebotomist, I don't think any interviewer is going to say, okay, here's my arm, take my blood. It just doesn't work for that type of job. But I'm a trainer. I train people on various topics. If someone wanted to hire me to teach their company Excel, it would be in their best interest to get a little snapshot of that. So they could say, prepare a 10-minute presentation on pivot tables and be prepared to present it as part of your interview. If you're a welder, what a lot of welding interviews are, in fact, the entire interview might be, go down to our welding shop and put these two pieces of metal together in 15 minutes. That will allow you to showcase what you can do. And then a group or a peer group interview, what that would be is it's an opportunity to meet with and talk with potential coworkers. In that situation, when there is someone in the room that would be around your level within the organization, it's really important to not dismiss someone simply because you don't think they're the decision maker. We all in our mind kind of look at an interview panel and say, well, there's a person who's going to be making the decision, so I'm going to go to that person. That's the whole idea of a peer group, is to see how you interact with all levels. So whoever asks you the question, that's who you make the majority of your eye contact with, and that's who you answer the question for. It's okay to look around the room in a panel interview to see what other people are presenting, or are they accepting of what you're putting out there? Are you getting any body language that maybe would mean you need to give more information? But always refocus on the person who asked you the question. They can be decision makers. In fact, anyone in that organization can contribute to the final decision. When I used to hire at another job I was at, I always went to my receptionist and asked, what did you think? How did they interact? You saw them in the waiting room for half an hour. What were their behaviors? And really, when people are, not on thinking that they're in the interview, they may display some things that they wouldn't otherwise. And that has had a real impact. If my receptionist would say, well, he got on his phone and he was talking to somebody and he actually swore. Well, that's not someone I want working for me if they're going to do that in a place of business. So when you go in the door, treat everyone with respect. Obviously, if anyone asks you a question, give them your full attention, make good eye contact. There's a lot that can be looked at during the interview by a lot of different people. It's not necessarily just the decision maker. All right, so we're going to move along here.
Art, do you want to take a
Sheila,
question?
go ahead. Yes.
Okay. Someone is asking, how do you handle 2 interviews in a row, behavior interviews in a row with the same people and the same questions? You can't use the same examples, correct?
Well, you can, in some cases, use the same example, just go about it from a different perspective. So if you've been in the military, and that's where your experience is, you can go overboard with saying, well, yes, in the military, again, when I had the deployment and we did this, you can use the example as a whole, that work situation, or even the situation, the conflict that was overcome or whatever, but come at it from a different angle. Ideally, you've got a pool of stories to pull from. So what I do for behavioral-based questions, and we'll dig into this deeper here in a minute, is I try to think of what are the standard questions that are asked. I'm not going to know exactly how they're going to phrase them, but they generally don't ask questions outside of a kind of standard group. Things like talk about where you've had a disagreement with a coworker. Have you ever had to do something your boss told you not to, or have you had to think on your feet during a situation? How do you handle crisis? Whatever. You look, and what I do is I Google top 30 behavioral-based interview questions. I don't care what group of questions you get. They're generally going to give you a good sampling. And you try to come up with answers, stories, I would say up to 10 stories to pull from. And then when they ask you a question, you determine what situation best handles that question. If you don't do this in advance, you're not going to have that pool of experiences to draw from. And you're not going to know how to frame your answers. And we'll talk about how to frame behavioral-based questions. That's where you can practice. That's where you can prepare more than other people will. Remember when I said at the very beginning, interview is one of the easiest parts of the hiring process to improve at. That's the number one for me. Coming up with examples, coming up with stories, coming up with successes that I can talk about during the interview. And the reason people don't do this is they assume they're not going to know what questions they're going to ask. And you don't. But you're going to know the general idea of what they want to get from you. And no matter how they phrase the question, you're going to have stories prepared that will meet that criteria. So yeah, so simple answer is you don't want to use the same exact story over and over again, but the way to get around that is to have more stories to pull from. All right, so communicating your best image, sending good signals. If you're not someone who's extremely comfortable with eye contact, and not a lot of people are, that's something to practice. I always try to mirror the comfort level of who I'm dealing with. If I look at someone's, in the eye and they are just, looking over to the side, doesn't mean they're shifty, doesn't mean they're not trustworthy. It just means that maybe they're not comfortable with eye contact. In a panel interview, you've got it made. You don't have to look just at one person. You can look around the room a little bit. But if you find that person who is very comfortable with eye contact, don't make the mistake of just talking to them, because everyone else in the room still expects you to be looking at them, to be answering their questions and giving you their attention, even though their comfort level might not be the same. As far as show and tell, you want to back up your statements with samples of your productivity. And that, again, is just, when you tell a story, what are the end results? What benefit? What benefited the customer? What benefited the coworker? What benefited your boss, your organization? There should always be results, positive results of your stories. You may not start your interview the way you want. You may be very embarrassed because you stumbled over the first question or the second question. That's okay, that happens. Everyone does that. I do that. The key is never give up on an interview. Always finish strong. Always leave them with the impression that you still want this job and that you feel you're still in the running. I've had people self-filter. I've had them drop out of interviews simply because it started poorly. You don't know what the perception of the employer is. You don't even know how they perceived the answer you gave. They may have thought it was just fine, or they may not have understood it and may not put as much emphasis on the negativity as you did. So always finish strong. I always make a case at the very end of an interview, if I'm still interested, is to tell them, I want you to know that this is really solidified for me, that this interview process, that I think I could do good work for this company. I think I would be happy here, and I'm extremely excited to work with the people I've met today. That leaves the interviewer with a really good, positive impression of what you feel you could do for the company and your interest in the job. And then the follow-up, there's a lot of different things you can do for follow-up, and they don't necessarily work in all cases. Some companies will tell you, don't call us, we'll call you. There's some things you can do even with that. But for right now, what I'm talking about is your follow-up. What are you going to do? Think about the last interview you were at, and I want you to ask yourself this question, or I want you to answer this question internally. Do you remember every question they asked you? And do you remember every answer you gave? I don't. And I do this for a living. Think about that. If you can't remember the particulars of the interview you just did, or the last interview you did, and you didn't get the job, or you did get the job, how are you going to determine what worked and didn't work? How are you going to get feedback from other people like career force representatives on how you could improve? So what I did when I did placement, for many years, I always did a follow-up with my consumers. And I would say, okay, you just had an interview. Let's go through it. Did you write down all the questions you can remember? Did you write down all your responses? Where did you get good feedback? Where were they, where were they giving you the nods of the head? Were there any sticking points? Did any questions cause you to panic? Did any questions really allow you to tell good stories? What was the follow-up? What did they say you could do? When are they going to make the decision? You got to write that down all as soon as you can, because you'll forget it very, very quickly. We only can improve on things we've identified as sticking points. And you don't want to make the same mistakes over and over again. And you want to build on successes. So really important to do that internal follow-up. I am a believer in sending thank you letters. I know you'll get a lot of different opinions on this. Many people will say, don't send a thank you letter, just send an email. Send an email, that's great. But if you really want the job, sending the thank you card, also a handwritten thank you card, if you've got good penmanship, can't hurt. They may get it after they made the decision, okay? The reality of interviews is we generally don't, in fact, if you look at the figures, we get fewer jobs than jobs we interview for. I'm gonna put those kind of stats out there. So if I am in a pool of 5 candidates, equally qualified candidates, and I'm vying for a position, I've got a 20% chance of getting that job. I have an 80% chance of not getting that job. If I send a thank you card, even if I don't get the job, the next time I interview with that company, I've left a very positive last impression with them. I've hired people I've interviewed 3 times. I've been hired for jobs I've interviewed at twice. The reality is, in many cases, for really good jobs, we may interview with that company multiple times. So even if the thank you card gets there late, it still got there, and it still potentially could have an impact in a career with that company. But again, it's up to you. I always think, what can I do that other people wouldn't be willing to do? What can I do today that other people aren't willing to do? So tomorrow I have opportunities they don't, okay? And in some cases, that means I'm doing some busy work. I'm doing some things that don't have impact. But as long as they don't hurt, I'm willing to do that because it gives me the best opportunity. So let's talk about tough interview questions, handling tough interview questions. So you never want to come off as negative in an interview, but some questions are, they may ask something that appears to be negative. Like, tell me when you've had a disagreement with a policy at work that you thought was unethical. How did you handle it and what were the results? Well, in that case, it's really hard not to put out some uncomfortable information. So one of the methods you can do is the sandwich method. You can start it with something very positive. You can insert the negative situation without placing blame. That's important. Don't place blame on any person. Place blame on the situation, and then end it with a positive. So you could say, I had always appreciated working for my last employer. They were very above board and treated everyone with respect. However, there was some old information in the employee handbook that wasn't current with employment regulations as they sit now. I did alert my supervisor that there was something that bordered on being an illegal hiring practice in our handbook. Luckily, they were very receptive to that information, and we were able to fix that. And today's handbook has the new information, and people are treated in a very ethical and fair manner. And that's a positive. So it's a positive, negative, positive. Those are the types of things that you can really kind of sketch out ahead of time through something called the STAR method. And that's our next slide that we'll be talking about here in a minute. But the more of those stories you have, and the better you plan out on how to handle them, so it always ends on a positive, the more easily you're going to be able to be within the flow of the interview. There are some questions that are going to stump you. If you don't have an answer, you can think about it. That's one of the things that I don't think people use enough, which is time. An employer does not want you to just blurt out the first thing that comes to your mind. It's okay to have silence. I know it's uncomfortable. It's ridiculously uncomfortable really quick, but you have up to 15 seconds, I would think. And this is the feedback I've gotten from employers to kind of think of things, and you do one of those kind of looking up to the sky. Well, that's a very interesting question. Let me think if I can come up with a good example for you. See how it's uncomfortable almost immediately? That's fine. Come up with a good answer. If you can't come up with a good answer and nothing's coming to you, don't say, I don't really have an example to give you. Say, nothing's coming to me right now, and I want to make sure I give you a good answer. Could we circle back to this question at the interview just to be mindful of our time together? That's not the best possible answer. I mean, the best possible answer is to have an example, but it's the best option given that you can't come up with something. And they will circle back to it, and that gives you some time. So anticipate the questions. Like I said, Google, just look up, do a web search on interview questions. They're going to ask you some that you can't prepare for maybe, but when I've really worked to prepare someone for an interview, I've gotten the feedback that, gosh, most of the questions that they asked were ones that we had samples for. It's a process. Be positive, honest, keep it brief. 60 to 90 seconds in an in-person interview is what I recommend. You really don't want to take up the entire interview with one or two questions. I've been in situations where I asked someone to tell me a little bit about themselves and they've gone on for 20 minutes and I had to break them. I had to stop. It became very uncomfortable. You can kind of read the room, and if you see people fidgeting or looking around, that might be a sign that you've talked too much. And it's nervous talking. Everyone does it. So the more you practice to time yourself, the more easily it will be to cut yourself off. And the more prepared your answers are, the easier it is to have kind of edges to it. If you're thinking of something off the top of your head, there's no edges to it. There's just when you run out of ideas and you may ramble on a bit. So 60 to 90 seconds is a general idea. Some questions are going to be shorter. Some questions are going to require more information. And then always focus on skills. I'll get you a question in just a minute here when we finish this up, Sheila. If your answer does not demonstrate a skill set, it's not benefiting you. So every answer you give should have a positive impression on what you have to offer. Did you negotiate? Did you problem solve? Did you do conflict resolution? Did you increase something for the company? Did you help a customer out? All right, Sheila, is there some questions we need to get to?
Yeah, there's just one. Someone's asking if you've prepared answers, is it okay to say 1 second, please, while I find my note, or reference other materials that you've prepared?
In most cases, no. I would not recommend that. We write these things down and we practice them so we have a framework. We don't want to, or an outline, we don't want to read verbatim off notes. That's a canned response. You want to have the idea of what you want to get across, which is a perfect segue into this next slide. This, to me, is the gold standard for interviews. It's where I spend all of my time preparing. I look at potential questions they may ask based off of standard questions, off questions I would assume a company would ask, or maybe feedback I've gotten from my networking for people who have worked there, or things I've gotten off websites like Glassdoor.com, which will give some feedback on employers and the interview process. I'll include that in the follow-up information, by the way, that link to that website. Or maybe I went on their LinkedIn account and based on the research, I was like, well, they may ask a question about this. I put a list of those questions together, and then I really just diagram out this STAR story. And I get some idea of what I want to get across, and I practice it. Once I'm saying it in person, I'm not going to remember every single word I wanted to tell them. But I'm going to get the general idea because I put it into this situation, task, action, result. So I'm going to give you an example. Let's say that they asked you, tell me about a time where you've had a very difficult customer. How did you handle it? And what were the results to that relationship with the company? Well, that's a lot to unpack. Okay, but it really just goes to, how do I deal with customers that, maybe need more than I can offer, or I wasn't prepared for their behaviors or whatever. Key is, in your mind, you're thinking about the worst customer you ever had. And you're thinking about the emotion behind it. Don't go with the emotion behind it. Go with the story of when you had a difficult customer and you were able to help that person, okay? So, situation. I worked as an Alzheimer's care provider for many years, and I had a new resident who came into our care, and he was very, very confused, and he was not used to the environment, and he was somewhat combative. And the first time he was with me, he punched me in the nose. Now, notice right there, situation, new resident, and he punched me in the nose. I've got your attention. That's a hook. Now people are paying attention. I needed to figure out a way to calm him down and to let him know that, this is a new place to live, and his needs were going to be met. And so that's the task. Okay, so now I'm getting to what I needed to accomplish. Action is what steps you took to accomplish that task. So what I'm going to say now is, so I sat down at the kitchen table. I brought some pudding out, and I found that pudding is a really good icebreaker with new residents. And once we started getting the pudding, I started talking about, with this resident, what had happened 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And, that's where his memory was. And he started talking about how he would make sandwiches for lunch every day. And he'd make pastrami on wheat and whole wheat and ham, and he'd use mayo and not Miracle Whip and all these different things. And I found that was a memory trigger for him. That's what brought him to a happy place. So what I found was, and this is the result, I'm getting to the result, that before I asked this resident to take medication, before I asked this resident to get ready for bed or whatever he needed to do for that day, I would ask him, what kind of sandwiches are we making today? I needed to engage in a 2-minute conversation on a variety of different sandwich topics, and now I could ask him to do what needed to be done. So, situation, had a new resident who was very angry and punched me. Task, I needed to find a way to effectively deal with this resident for their benefit and for mine. Action, I talked about what made them happy. I figured it out. Result, in creating that situation in which I could bring up those happy memories, I was able to get what needed to be done. Now, this is not something you're going to think off the top of your head. This is something that you're going to need to plan out. And I have found that when you do that, you can do it in 60 to 90 seconds. And if you have a well planned out good story that maybe you got some feedback, you tried it in a mock interview, or you did it with your friends to try it out, it really creates an impact. And you can look in the eyes of your interviewer and you can see that connection to, oh, this person has a process for excellent customer service. They think of it as, how do I troubleshoot? What steps do I take? That is, if they find that person, they'll train that person into the job. That's what behavioral-based questions are. They're, who am I dealing with, so I can see if it's worth investing the training dollars. The resume, the application, that's to see if you have the qualifications. At least 50% of the interview is, who are you? Are you someone I want to work with? Will you fit in with this organization? And that's why they ask these behavioral-based questions. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the key interview questions. Go ahead, Sheila.
Yeah, just one question, Art. Someone wants to know how much research comes into play on your social media sites prior to an interview.
So if you ask, I've asked this question of a lot of employers. I'm sure Sheila has worked with employers on this too. Some employers will admit it. Most won't. They say, we don't have time for that. Well, we don't do that. We interview too many people. We don't have time for that. I always assume they're going to. My entire social media presence is predicated on how will this affect me long term. Even if employers don't look, think about this. We find most of our jobs through networking. I have found almost all of my jobs in some way, shape, or form through networking. We network with the same people we interact with on social media. So if you're putting out things that are inappropriate or political or whatever, I get it. We all have opinions, and we have the right to express those opinions. Express them on a one-to-one basis. Don't express them on social media, because what happens then is your entire network is seeing that. And even though they may like you as a person, they don't want to align themselves with what you're putting out on social media. So they're not going to refer you to opportunities. And employers who find that certainly are not going to engage on that. So does that mean we can't have any fun? No, it does not mean that. But really do a audit of your social media. I put bird pictures. I'm a birder. I love looking at birds. So I post pictures of birds. If an employer doesn't like birds, I don't want to work for them. I do not put anything political. I have political interests, political beliefs, like everybody does. But I have those conversations one-on-one. So again, assume they do. As far as LinkedIn, we don't generally put any personal beliefs on LinkedIn. It's all about our professional accomplishments and that sort of thing. However, where that can affect you is if you are not, if you don't have a completed profile on LinkedIn, work on either deleting that or finishing it, because it does represent you as soon as it's out there. And if it's incomplete, it's worse than not having anything. If it's out of date, it's worse than not having anything. I'm a big believer in LinkedIn. I use it a lot, but it's not for everybody. I totally understand that. If you have one that you created for another employer and you haven't used for 5-10 years, work on that process of getting it deleted, because that takes a while, or updating it and showing the new stuff you have to offer, because it is just another opportunity, and a very professional one, of getting an employer more information about you. And that's how I view it. All right, so some of the key interview questions. One, tell me about yourself. This is one that I just assume they're going to ask. Frame it in your mind as, tell me about what you've done professionally that would benefit me. That's how I frame it in my mind. So I only give them enough information to set the stage that my past benefits your future. So I tell them a little bit about my professional background as it relates to this position and why I'm interviewing for this or applying for this position. I do not go into personal information, even though it seems to ask that. Employers don't even want to know that. Most employers don't. And I've had people talk about their church, their kids, their wife, their husband, their, where they moved to, the different jobs they've had that don't relate to the position. And, I've had to cut people off because, it becomes a safe point of, I know myself, I can talk about myself. So have that, I hate to say scripted, but have an outline of what you want to get across for that position, because it changes for every job you interview slightly. Why are you interested in working for this company? I ask that of every candidate. And then I also asked, why should I hire you? Those are two things that will make some people stumble, and it cannot be the wage. That may be the number one reason you're applying, but it's not going to be the reason they hire you. The fact that you want to get paid a lot of money, which we all do, I do, is not a reason to hire you. The reason they're going to hire you is because you feel you can do the job and you'd be happy here long term. When people make decisions strictly on pay, they will jump ship and go to another job simply because that job pays more. I get that. We do transfer jobs because of pay, but people who are happy within a position generally stay longer. In fact, in most cases, stay longer. So there's a larger return on investment. So make a case for why you would be satisfied here, why you would be happy here. Especially if you're overqualified for a position, it's really important to make that case, because an employer may wonder why you are applying for this position and why you won't jump for a better opportunity down the road. We'll be sending everyone in a document on overcoming objections to overqualification. The key is only give them the information for this position, not necessarily the positions you've had in the past that required more of you, that paid you more. That can be a stumbling block, because we're proud of those, and we should be. However, it can raise a red flag for employers about the possibility of you leaving for another position before you've kind of recouped their cost on training you for this one. I hate the question, and employers hate asking it, but it's still asked. What is your major weakness? There's a lot of internet answers out there. Look up the questions online. Don't look up the answers online. I have interviewed 5 candidates and gotten the same answer to that question from every single one of them. And it becomes annoying. I don't want to hear someone else's story. I don't want to hear someone else's answer. I want to hear your answer. If your answer is similar to other people's, fine, but make sure you put some personal information into it. If you are a perfectionist, talk about how you've overcome that. I asked you about a weakness. I didn't ask you about a strength. So the benefit of that question, the positive, is how you've dealt with it, not how it's not really a weakness, it's a strength. I'm sure you've heard turn a weakness into a strength during an interview. The strength is how you deal with the weakness. It's not the weakness itself. And it can't be something you completely overcome. I've had someone say, you know, in the past, Excel was a really tough program for me, but I took this online course and am now a Microsoft certified Excel instructor. Well, I asked what a major weakness was. I didn't say what a strength was, and you didn't answer the question. So an example could be, let me see, you know, handwriting. I get a lot of information. I get a lot of information every day that I have to write notes for and disperse to other people. My handwriting has never been as professional as I would like it to be. It's something I do practice, and if I take extra time, I can make sure that I make it legible. However, that's not always possible. So I use other means. I use email. I'll call somebody, but I always make sure to follow up the next day to make sure they receive the message if I didn't talk to them personally. It's something I'm still working on. It's a work on progress, but it's not really where I need it to be right now. Okay. Now, if that has nothing to do with the job, that's not a good example. But if it's part of the work and it's not a deal breaker, it's a legitimate example to give. It's one of the ones that you can kind of have in the bag, ready to go when they ask that question. More important is what are your strengths? If you don't have a strength to talk about, why should they hire you? Your best strength might not be something that's needed for the job. So think about, within the scope of the work they want you to do, what do you excel at? Try to get like 3 of them. And don't only put those into play when they ask about the strength. That should be part of every answer you give. You can inject strength and selling points into any of the questions you answer. Remember, they ask the question, which takes maybe 15 seconds to ask. You're giving a 60 to 90-second answer. So really, you have more power. You're giving more information than they are. So make sure you use that wisely to promote what you're good at. Certainly answer the question they ask, but how we answer that question is up to us. And we can inject a lot of our strengths within the answers to our questions. One of the questions is asked quite a bit is an example of how you've solved a problem. So that's one of those standard questions that you can develop a star story for. It's a really good one to have something ready for. And then one of the ones that trips a lot of people up, especially older workers, is where do you see yourself in 3 years? The reason they ask this question is they can't ask you, are you planning to retire? Or they can't ask you how old you are. Or they probably won't ask you, are you going to retire in 3 years? But they could say, where do you see yourself in 3 years? They can ask this of anybody, and it has slightly different purposes depending on who they're asking. If it's a young person, they may be wanting to know, is this, a minor stepping stone? Are you going to be, going somewhere else? Do you have a plan? Have you thought of this as a career or a get-me-by job? For an older worker, it might be, are you close to retirement? And I want to know, do you have this? Have you thought this out for the near future? So developing a answer to that question can take a lot of stress out of the questions. I mean, you really take the stress out of an interview the more you prepare. And again, I'm going to mention this one more time. If they ask you a question you're not prepared for, that happens. Don't worry about it. You may trip up about it, give your best answer you can, but I have found the more prepared you are, the more you can focus on your skills and abilities, and the less stressed you're going to be in the process. It's okay to be nervous in an interview. You should be a little nervous in an interview. If you're not, you probably don't want the job, or you're not invested in this opportunity. I can see that in an interview. Someone who's nervous but still is prepared, That's the person I want. All right. So as far as, go ahead, Sheila.
Yeah, one question, Art. How do you answer the question, why did you leave your last job, when you were fired for reasons on your own part and the supervisor's part? And also, can a past employer tell a prospective employer you were fired?
Great question. This is one that we get a lot. And I'm going to give you the quick answer, and then I'll which seems like a cop-out, and then I'll give you a little more information. Those situations are so specific to what happened between you and that employer that it's a really good idea to use one of the one-on-one sessions with the local career force representative to spend an hour, basically, or half hour, excuse me, on really working out what the best answer for that is. Okay, I'll give you an example of one situation and how we handled it. So I was working with a gentleman who was very, very, very confident. He was a salesperson and extremely good at what he did. Confidence is a big part of that. And we just had a conversation in an unemployment session. And I said, hey, I'm going to do the follow-up session. Do you need any help with anything? I teach an interview class. And he said, I don't need help with interviews. I've had 6 interviews in the last 2 weeks. And he kind of did say it just like that. And I said, well, how many offers have you had? And he said, it was kind of like a light bulb moment. He's like, none. And so we kind of went through, how is it going? And what are they responding to? And he said, they always ask me this question, why did you leave your last job? And he says, I tell them, I left my last job because they fired me. I went to a family member's funeral and they fired me because of it. And I thought, wow, that's horrible. That's horrible. Who would do such a thing? And then we talked about it and found out there was a story behind it. And there was more information. And we delved into it. And we took a half hour. And we figured out a way to tell that story that didn't lie, put it all out there, but we sandwiched it between, I worked for my last employer for 6 years. It was a top salesperson the last 5 years. Unfortunately, in the last year of my employment, I had a sick family member who I had to care for. And I had to use up a lot of my sick time and personal time and vacation time. Unfortunately, towards the end, I did end up exceeding attendance requirement and they ended up having to let me go. I really appreciated what I learned there. I can bring that information to this new job immediately. That situation has resolved itself. And prior to the last 6 months of my employment with that job, I've had excellent attendance, and I would bring that to your company. It was something like that we put together. That person had an interview the next day, used that example, and was offered the job on the spot. That was a sticking point. It's not that they want to not hire you. They want to hire you. Don't give them a reason not to. So when you throw an employer under the bus or you lie about a situation, that gives them a reason not to hire you. They just want to know, why is it not an issue now? So taking ownership of it, attendance is the #1 reason people are fired. You're not showing up for work. And there's legitimate reasons for that. Good people get fired every day. Figure out how to answer the question and then figure out how to frame it in a way that's not going to hurt you, because any amount of anger you bring into it doesn't hurt your former employer. It only hurts you in that situation. So again, reach out to a career force representative and find out. Now, as far as the legality, a lot of people, and this is my opinion, but I'll stand behind it. A lot of people assume that an employer won't or can't tell, a former employer can't tell someone that, they fired you. So when it said, may we contact your former employer, and you say, yep, because they can't answer that. They can only give dates of employment. They can say whatever they want. The reason employers generally don't is because they don't want to be sued. They don't want to have you come back and say, hey, you caused me to lose an opportunity with an employer because you said I was fired. Well, if you were fired, and if they can stand behind the cause by which you were fired, they can say whatever they want. So don't assume that they're not going to. When in doubt, call. I've had a lot of people who say, I was fired from my last job. And I go, okay, did you get a letter? Well, yeah, in the letter, they said it was a permanent layoff because the position no longer exists. Hey, that's what they said. that's what's in writing, that's what you can prove, that's what you go with. Just because in your mind you felt it was a firing doesn't mean it was a firing. So calling, and I know that's an uncomfortable conversation to have, calling and ask to see what's in your company file. How is this termed? What was the reason? And what information do you give to when people call about this? Will kind of, let you not obsess over that, because I know for many people, that's a huge sticking point, and that's where they focus all their energy. Remember, you're focusing your energy on the positive parts. Deal with the negative parts, come up with an answer, do what you can, and then really focus your energy on what the strengths and what the good things you have to talk about. All right. So you can go ahead, Sheila.
Do you want to take a follow-up to that, Art?
Sure. Yep.
Someone is asking, you were let go because you didn't fit in, and generally you do fit in at your place of work. So how would you respond to that?
It depends on when it was done. If it was done during the probationary period, that's a, try before you buy basically thing. And you can say, hey, it became very obvious to my employer and me that this was not a good fit. The research I had done led me to believe it would be, otherwise I wouldn't have hired. But they came to determination that it just wasn't the right job for me, and I appreciate them doing that before we got too invested in the training. And I'm glad they made good use of that probationary period. All of my previous employment has been long-term, 3 to 5 years. And so I've been very fortunate to fit in with the majority of the employers that I have worked for. That would be an example. I'd work on that a little bit. But again, the key here is, even though I may feel some emotion behind that, I don't place blame on them, because it's not going to help me. I explain that, here's what happened. I owned it. And then I give them the positive of, my previous employment was not indicative of this. This is not what you're going to get, that I won't fit in. I fit in multiple locations. It just wasn't a good fit in this particular situation. Okay. So interview practice, you can practice with friends, family members. You can practice with us. You can do it in person. You can do it online. Someone could send you a link, just like we did today, to an online session through Microsoft Teams or WebEx, and you can turn your camera on. If you're going to do it in person, I highly recommend you use your phone to record yourself. No one likes what they sound like recorded. You ever done that? You record yourself and say, I don't sound like that. Or did I say 58 times in 2 minutes? Those are things you're going to see and understand if you watch yourself. It's no fun watching yourself recorded. Most people don't like it, at least, but it's a really good method to improve on things that you want to. The more prepared you are, the less we interrupt ourselves with the ums and the and the you knows. So that's something we can work on. Body language, eye contact, those things are things we can see on video also. But really practice, and it's perfectly okay to say, okay, I prepared answers to these 10 questions. I'm going to give you the questions. Could you ask them? And then I'm going to give you my answers, and then could you give me some feedback? That's perfectly okay. Okay. You can also ask them, could you throw in a couple of extra ones of your choosing? The type of work I do is in this industry. Give us a little lead time. We can do that for you. We only get better at what we practice. And unfortunately, most people think of interviewing as I want to get through this so I can do the work. I get that. But the interview is the gatekeeper to most jobs. So becoming good at interviewing, or better at interviewing, is going to help you more quickly get to what you really want to do, which is the work. All right. And then some post-interview steps. Contact your references, recap the interview, let them know kind of what the feedback you got from the employer, what you thought of it. Highlight the points you might want them to discuss if they do call on references. Also, it's just really good networking. I bring my references into my job search immediately. I don't wait till the very end, but at the end, they can have a lot of impact. You might say, hey, I really think I got a shot at this. I'd like to send some follow-up information. I didn't do a letter of recommendation, but they talked a lot about change management. And remember, we did that carryover of that new program a couple of years ago together. Would you mind writing a letter of recommendation for me that discusses that? I really think that would be a great follow-up thing to send them. I've done that, by the way, and I think it really tipped the scales in my favor. letters of recommendation can be sent at any point that they're willing to accept them. Sometimes it's with the application, rarely, but sometimes. Sometimes it can be during the interview in which you hand it to them. I've also done it as a follow-up option. It's something you could send with a thank you or a week later if you haven't heard. I send thank yous. Not everyone's going to. At the very least, send an email and say, thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss this position. I look forward to hearing your decision. It just, if 5 people interview and 1 person sends a thank you, if they're all qualified and it's a toss-up, I'm going to go with the person who followed up. It's just good business because those people really want the job. All right, Sheila, are there any more questions we need to get to before we wrap it up today?
Just one. It says my last boss offered a recommendation letter but wants to tailor it to each job. Is it better if she did a generic one?
You know, it depends on what kind of work. If you're applying for 10 jobs a day, I don't think that's a good thing, but some people do. That'd be really hard to keep up with. But if you are really focusing on a few jobs and they're willing to do it, a tailored approach is always better. If they're willing to do that, I'd take them up on that. And the way you can do that is you send them the job posting and any additional notes or research that you've done so they can speak to specific needs and make the connections between their experience with you and the needs of the employer. Very few people are willing to do that, so take them up on it. I would recommend that. All right, thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time on this kind of odd week in between Christmas and the New Year's. You're doing right now what many people are unwilling to do, which is to invest in your job search during this kind of downtime. Employers are still hiring, so get out there. I wish you all the best of luck in your job search, and I hope you get the job you're looking for as we start the new year. Have a great week, everyone.